Well, haven't we had a stimulating morning? We've had maths and language and history and engineering. This afternoon, it's a bit of soft, squashy biology. Okay. Let's start with a scientific question. A few years ago, the science journal Nature published an editorial where they suggested that scientists should consult theologians on ethical issues. And a very irate atheist wrote in, and he said, I was horrified to read the recent editorial, and the name of it was Where Theology Matters. That's the reference there in Nature, in the world's foremost science journal. Not only did the editorial appear to support the position that science and religion deal with different aspects of reality, which they do not. For example, Jesus either rose from the dead or he didn't. Clearly a scientific question. Now, that's an interesting insight from an atheist, isn't it? He's sort of right and he's sort of wrong as well. Now, in Jesus' day, it actually was a scientific question, and Jesus let them do the scientific research. Remember when he appeared to the disciples for the first time and they said, oh no, it's a ghost. And he said, no, this is me, the Jesus you knew. Here I am in my living body with flesh and bones, and I'll have some fish and chips for supper. Well, maybe not the chips. Jesus would have eaten healthier. So he let them do their scientific research by actually observing what was going on around them. He did the same for Thomas. We pour scorn on him, but Jesus didn't. He just gave him the opportunity to make the same observations. But Jesus also said that those who weren't able to see would be blessed. Now, it's not because they somehow were going to sort of close their eyes and conjure up a lot of blind faith. Jesus knew he was going to ascend into heaven, so people wouldn't be able to make those observations, but all of the events would be written down. We would have the written record of what happened, so it has gone from being science to history. But the atheist is right in terms of these are not different aspects of reality. It's all one reality. It either happened or it didn't. It's real. So is it a scientific question? It is if you have things to observe in the present. Is it a historical question? If you have a written record from reliable witnesses who were there, you have a historical question. Either way, you are looking at reality, so it is a bit of both. So the real issue in this whole area of creation and evolution is not science versus religion. It's often touted as that. The real question is, what is the real history of the real world? And we had a fabulous introduction to that with Andy this morning, didn't we? So that's really good. So how are we going to tackle what is the real history of the real world? And what evidence is there in the world that we can observe today? Because if something in the past, there will be evidence for us to see. How do we find the truth? Well, for a start, we have to know what the Bible actually says, and a lot of skeptics don't. But take that as an opportunity to look at what the Bible actually says when they say, oh, I don't believe the Bible because it says such and such a thing. They may not be quoting it correctly. If they are, go to the context. So know what the Bible says, and don't be afraid to check out the science. Now, you may think, well, you know, I'm an accountant or an economist or an artist or something like that. I don't know any science. You can still check out the science. There are good sources of information for lay people. And of course, the best is creation research. We have a regular newsletter where we just trawl the normal scientific literature. What gets reported in the science world today on the normal resources that people can access, and you can check out the science and look at it through God's eyes, look at it knowing what the truth is. So let's have a potted history of the real world, as it were. We had a much more detailed one from Andy, so we'll just briefly go through a few things. In the beginning, God created, and God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. Isn't that wonderful? But when we look around the world today, it's not all that very good. For example, what would a very good world would be? It would be where there's no suffering and no pain or anything like that. So there would be no violence, there would be no struggle, and we are specifically told all the animals ate plants, they didn't eat each other. There was no pain and suffering and no death. Wouldn't it be wonderful to live in a world like that? Well, we'll come back to that. Now, the world did not stay good. There was rebellion and there was judgment. Now, that's often put together and referred to as the fall of man. Now, this is not a theological concept. Certainly does involve some theology and understanding the nature of God and the nature of man, but it was a real event in real history, and it was the world's first ecological disaster. God cursed the ground. Death came into the world. By the time of Noah, we're told that the world had become corrupt and filled with violence. There was more judgment. Noah's flood, which we had a brief look at this morning. And after Noah's flood, we are told that there will be extreme seasons, summer and winter, cold and heat, from now until the end of the world. So we can summarise all of this with a simple diagram of the real history of the world. It was created good, but it has degenerated because of sin and judgment. So the world has certainly changed, there's no doubt about that, but it has not evolved. It's done the opposite. Evolution, simple to complex. Creation, or the Bible, created design full of beauty, perfection and complexity, and we saw some of that with the seahorses this morning. Wasn't that amazing? Right. But things are going downhill. So if things started out perfect and complex, all the changes are going to be lost. And Craig introduced us to that idea this morning, and I want to build on that a little bit further on. So, what are we told about the very good world? We don't live in that anymore, but if that's what the world was like in the beginning, there should be some evidence that the world was like that sometime in the past. There'd be some vestiges of it left over. Well, we're told a very interesting thing about how the world was watered. A mist rose up from the earth and watered all the earth. So instead of having violent rainstorms and floods and all sorts of things, we just had this lovely mist rising up, watering all the earth. Lovely and peaceful. Right. Now, the other interesting thing we are told specifically about is what things ate, including human beings, but we'll look at human beings on the third day. The original diet for every beast of the earth and every bird of the heavens and everything that creeped on the ground, so all the creepy crawlies, anything that had the breath of life should eat green plants, and it was so. Okay? Now, we weren't there to observe that, but we are told from the reliable witness who was there. That's what it was like in the beginning. So we should see some evidence that things were like that in the past, but they've changed. Right. So what do we see in the living world in general? We see creative design followed by degeneration. And we find it in some rather unlikely places. How about this one? Now, for an arachnophobe like me to admit that spiders might be have some goodness in them, well, you just have to take that on faith. God said everything was good, so I believe him. All right, the goodness is when you come across something like that. If you've been walking on a misty morning and you've come across something like that, and even I can say, well, that is rather pretty because of all the water droplets. And so some scientists decided that they would investigate this, and they wrote up their research in that prestigious scientific journal, Nature again, with this title, Directional Water Collection on Wetted Spider Silk. Okay. So this is how they described their research. Here we show that the water collecting ability of the capture silk, okay, that's the silk in their webs, of this particular spider, is the result of a unique fibre structure that forms after wetting. With the wet rebuilt fibres, in other words, there's something about being exposed to moisture, the fibres, characterised by periodic spindle knots made from random nanofibrils separated by joints made from aligned nanofibrils. Okay, well let's explain that. Again, I like drawings. I like words too. Okay, this is what the dry silk looks like. So you have a central, and you have a whole lot of these sort of loose, puffy structures. When the silk is wet, the puffs shrink into a distinctive set of spindle shapes. Okay, you know what a spindle shape is? It has a sort of central core with curved on either side. And when the silk is exposed to fog or to that sort of misty moisture, water drops will form on the silk. And because of that shape, because of the spindle structure, the surface properties will actually force the droplets to move towards the spindles to the central, where they just coalesce, and you eventually get these bigger and bigger droplets until you get this typical pattern with the water droplets that in the early sunrise look all sparkly, and they do look quite pretty, don't they? Yes. Now, an interesting thing as part of the research, they wrote, inspired by this finding, we designed artificial fibres that mimic the structure or the structural features of the silk and exhibit its directional quarter collecting ability. In other words, they saw this structure, they studied it with various very sophisticated scientific instruments, electron microscopes and various other things. They said, all right, we can build that out of some artificial fibres, some synthetic fibres. If we follow the exact same structure that we see, we should be able to get the same effect. And they did. But think about what it took to get that effect. And they admitted it took design, it took creative design. Now, the interesting thing is, this research was written up in one of the science news services that goes out to that anyone can access and read, and goes out to the general secular media, like the BBC on their website. They will pick up things from the scientific journals. And the research was actually challenged by some skeptics. Now, these were not creationist skeptics saying, you just designed something. No, these were evolutionary skeptics. And one of them, a zoologist and a spider silk expert from the University of Oxford, fairly prestigious place, wrote, the authors of this paper are studying an artefact which is still interesting, although it has no biological function. Gathering water happens to be one of the most basic biological functions there is. Why do you think NASA have spent billions of dollars sending things to Mars to look for water? Because they have this obsession with finding life on a place other than Earth. Astronomers regularly announce, oh, we found water in outer space or on exoplanet J81, blah, blah, blah. To try and get people to think, yes, there's life in outer space. If it can evolve in outer space, it can evolve here. That there's no logic in that. Gathering water is the most basic of biological functions. There's no doubt about that. You all experience that yourself. Right? And then another spider silk expert expressed the same idea, but he explained why the skeptics, that's the evolutionary skeptics, were thinking this. From the spider's perspective, this is a bad thing because it reduces the web's ability to capture prey. And that's true. When the web is wet, it's not very good at capturing bugs. Now, what are they thinking? They're thinking that the spider evolved in a world full of violence, struggle, things preying on one another, survival of the fittest, struggle for existence, etc. But it didn't. They've just found evidence that that's not what it was designed for. It was designed for capturing water. Now think about how brilliant it would be if it lived in a world where a mist rose up from the earth every morning. And we know that spiders actually do get a lot of their water from their own webs. In fact, they can a lot of them just ingest their own web completely. It's made out of protein. And scientists who study them have to make sure that if they do extract the silk from the spider, that they give the spider plenty of protein because it does deplete them. So this thing is designed for the good world, very well, for the world where the mist rose up from the earth, to collect water. We no longer live in that world. We live in a world where the environment's been ruined and the climate's been ruined, and we have dry places, so the webs don't get wet. Well, it just so happens that the dry web is useful for capturing prey, and spiders do know that they need protein, so it survives in the cursed world. But it was really designed for this world. So what about creatures that do seem to be really well designed for killing, like things with great big sharp teeth and claws and aggressive temperaments? Well, come back on Thursday and we will deal with those issues in the session called Fallen Design, From Nice to Nasty. I want to keep going with the evidence about this being the original environment. And I want to look at some of the processes claimed to be evolutionary processes, namely natural selection and adaptation. So the world was designed in the first place, and we could look at more examples of design, but we're very blessed to have Andy here, who's going to tell us some fantastic things about how living things are designed. It's just brilliant. All right. I want to keep going with this change in the environment and look at these supposed evolutionary processes and see how they fit in with what we are told is the real history of the real world. So let's think about that. If that was the real history of the real world, we've got a challenge. We've got to think outside the box. Okay, were there any deserts in that really good world? Are deserts good? No, they're not good places to live, are they? Things die in the desert. People die in the desert. There is a limited number of living things that can survive in the desert, right? Including the camel. And a lot of people say, well, if there weren't any deserts, why should creatures be apparently designed to live in the desert? And they do have a lot of really neat features that enable them to live in the desert, right? They have long eyelashes that would be the envy of any Hollywood star. They have slit-like nostrils, which they can actually open and close, so that's very good for keeping the sand out, right? And for keeping the moisture in as well, right? They have long, strong legs, so that means that their body is kept away from the ground, which gets extremely hot or extremely cold, right? They have these wide padded feet, which are very good for walking on soft or sandy sort of surfaces. And as I said, not all deserts are actually hot all the time. All deserts are actually cold at night. You look at the temperature range that you have out in Alice Springs. It's huge. The nights are very cold. Some deserts are actually cold all the time. And so the camel hair does provide insulation from both heat and cold. And of course, the famous humps do not actually store water. They store fat, but even that is useful. Did you know it is possible to get water out of fat? There are metabolic processes in living things which will convert fatty acids into a whole lot of other chemicals and water. And you do actually get some of your own water that way. It's called metabolic water, right? Meaning water that's produced from your own internal chemical processes. Now, camels do have to drink just like any other creature on the earth, but they do tolerate dehydration a lot more than other animals. So, do they have to live in the desert? Okay, well, they certainly do. No one disputes that. Well, in a word, no, they don't have to live in the desert. You can go and see camels in nice green places and they'll survive. In fact, they seem to quite like it. We also have to put in the human factor. When human beings spread out over the earth, when they wanted to trade with one another, when they wanted to fight with one another, and go exploring. They had to cross deserts, and a lot of transport animals do not tolerate those sort of conditions, but camels do. So there's a lot of human factor in the reason that camels appear to flourish in these places. So they are amenable to domestication, but only just. They're pretty grumpy. But other domestic animals don't tolerate desert conditions, so human beings had to keep going with them. But none of that explains how camels got those useful features in the first place. And this is where we've got to be careful that the evolutionists don't bluff us with words like adaptation and natural selection. You need to think of what those actually mean. Right. Camels already had those features when human beings noticed these would be a good means of transport in this particularly tough environment. And we know that from the history of Australia. There are camels in Australia. How did they get here? They certainly didn't evolve. Even though on the desert stakes, I think we win fairly well in terms of the percentage of our country that's desert. I dare say some of the Middle Eastern countries would beat us hands down in terms of the percentage of desert, but we've got a fair few deserts. They didn't evolve here, did they? Right. They were brought here by the early explorers, and this is commemorated at this is Alice Springs Railway Station. You can go and see this commemorative bronze. And most of the camels in Australia are feral, and they are the descendants of the original explorers' camels, who also brought the Afghans or the Middle Eastern people with them to control them. And so that's where you hear the phrase the gam. That's where it came from. They were brought here because they already had all of those features. So this is an example of survival of the fittest. That is exactly what you are observing. Camels are the fittest to survive in this tough environment. And of course, the other term for survival of the fittest is natural selection. But survival does not explain origin. And many people believe that because of this man. He popularised the belief in natural selection or in survival of the fittest as a means of the origin of things. He also wrote a lot about adaptation. But Charles Darwin's book title is this. Now, they were very verbose in Victorian England. They like to express themselves in many words. Now, most people only know the first line there, right? The origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. Now, are those two things the same? Is origin the same as preservation? Now, here is a man who studied at Cambridge University, another prestigious place, and he can't even write a piece of plain English. Origin and preservation are not the same. The whole world has been bluffed. Right. Isn't that interesting? And yet, for the sake of turning our backs on God, or people wanting to turn their backs on God, they've skipped over that and not picked Charles Darwin up on that. Let's look at the word select, right, or selection. The word select simply means to choose between existing alternatives. You can't select something if it doesn't already exist. It does not make anything new, which means selection in the living world does not make any new kinds of living things. It may eliminate the unfit things, the things that die in the desert, and it will allow the already fit things, the different kinds of creatures that have those features that are needed to survive. But that does not explain where they came from. It doesn't explain their origin. The fit only survive if they have the structures and functions that enable them to survive. So camels can survive in the desert, other animals can't. So there's not much competition out there, is there? Right? They were created for the good world because they do have a lot of really clever design features, and they survive in the fallen world. They fit our design, our biblical history. Created design, followed by degeneration, and the struggle, the natural selection, that all fits in the real history of the real world, but it's in the degenerative part. It's not in the creative part. And that's where the evolutionists have gone wrong. They want to make those processes creative processes. No, they're not. They're real processes, but they're degenerative processes. So we need to just put them in their proper place. We certainly observe them. So let's look at a couple of other examples of creatures designed to live in this kind of world where the mist rose up, the good world where the mist rose up. And ironically, they are also found in arid places, because a creature that can absorb water just from the atmosphere rather than having to drink up a pool of liquid water is going to survive better in an arid place, because there is moisture. In deserts, there's moist ground, there is humidity. So if it's designed to somehow extract that out of the air or out of the ground, it's going to survive better. Right? Now, here's a creature that also lives in Australia. Now, if ever a creature was burdened with a bad name, this has to be it. Moloch horridus. Moloch was one of the nastiest pagan gods that are referred to in the Bible. Really, he really was genuinely horrible. Right? Horror speaks for itself. Now, the common name for these things is thorny devils. Even that's not a particularly nice name, but in spite of that, they're actually cute little fellas. You pick them up and they won't hurt you. Their clever trick is, if you look at them closely, they are made up of a whole lot of little scales, some of which have all these spiky excrescences, which are quite good for collecting water. It can actually just stand on some damp earth, and the water will actually flow up through a whole lot of little tiny grooves in between its scales and eventually get to its mouth, and it'll get a drink. Isn't that clever? Yes. All right. Now, this is my favourite example of how to get water out of the atmosphere. Right? Some really cool frogs. Up in the savanna areas in northern Australia, some scientists were doing radio tracking of frogs. And they noticed that some of the frogs went out at night and either climbed onto a termite nest or onto a branch, and they just sat. Didn't do anything, they didn't chase any prey, or they just sat there, and they thought, well, what on earth are these frogs doing there, going out at night? I mean, they could be eaten. It's a silly thing to do. And then they went back to their burrows, and they couldn't work it out until they actually looked at the frogs in their burrows and found that the frogs had cooled down because they were out in the night air, and it does get quite cold in the savannah, and frogs are cold-blooded, so their whole body temperature goes down. But in the dry season, the frogs all get together and they will hole up in hollow logs, and they'll all sit there, and it gets quite warm and humid in these hollow logs. So the cool frogs go back to the warm and humid environment, and you get exactly the same effect as you get when you take a cold drink out of the fridge into your warm environment. What happens to it? The surface gets wet. Now, that's not liquid leaking from out of the container. That's moisture that was in the air that has condensed on the cool surface. Now, who taught the frogs physics? But they were doing this. They'd go out, cool down their bodies on the branches, out in the cool nights, and extract the water from their nice warm burrows. Now that's not all of the story, of course. Frogs absorb water and anything else through their skin. So they don't even need all of those little grooves that thorny devil has. They just absorb the water straight through their skin. Amphibians have different kind of skin to reptiles. Who taught the frogs that they have permeable skin? So, hot lizards, cool frogs. They were designed for a good world, but they survive in the cursed world. Now, while we're on the subject of coolness, let's look at another extreme environment. Was there any snow in the good world? Well, snow is just as dangerous as extreme heat, isn't it? So here is a little plant that lives in snow and overcomes it in a very clever way. This plant can actually grow and produce a flower in snow. And in fact, it produces enough heat to actually melt the snow out of the way so it can grow. Now, why would it do that? Why would this plant produce heat if it wasn't designed to grow in the sort of alpine areas or cold, snowy places in Alaska? And in order to do that, it has to burn up a lot of its own starch. In the base of the plant, it just burns this starch and produces heat, which is quite a waste of energy for the plant unless there's a good reason for it to do it. Well, we get a clue from its name. Right, here's another living thing with a horrible name. Okay, Symplocarpus foetidus. What does that tell you about it? Well, its common name will tell you the truth, right? Skunk cabbage. This is not a fragrant flower. This is a stinky flower. So what does that have to do with the heat? All right, the heat actually disperses the plant's aroma, and plants produce their aroma, we won't call it fragrance, in order to attract their pollinators. What pollinates this plant? Flies. Now, we're rather ambivalent to insects, aren't we? We approve of some insects, even though we might not like them. We approve of bees. We like some of them, they're really pretty. And I remember a few years ago, I wanted to take a photo of a water lily, and a dragonfly just landed just as I was taking the photo, and I was really pleased. I got a better photo. I was not pleased when every year they have a lovely display of spring flowers in Canberra called Floreat, and I was taking a photo of a white tulip in amongst a bunch of red ones, and a fly flew in and landed on the white one, of course, where it was most prominent. And it reminded me of that old joke, the Lord in his wisdom, he made the fly and then forgot to tell us why. No, he gave us brains for us to work it out for ourselves. Okay, right. There were flies in the original good world. After all, creation was complete with flies, and God declared them to be good. Flies do help break down animal waste. That is an essential ecosystem function. And some flies fertilise some flowers. In the cursed world, well, there's still plenty of animal waste, but there's also dead flesh as well, and flies help break that down. More essential ecosystem function. So not pretty, but good. Flies still fertilise some flowers, and there are other sources of warmth and nutrition available now because rotting animal waste and rotting flesh produces quite a lot of heat and quite a few aromas. And the flies respond to that, so we have more flies, don't we know it, in this country? So, was the plant designed to melt snow? No, it was created for the good world, but because it already has that clever feature, it can survive in the cursed world where other plants can't. Now, it's really clever how this plant does this, and you might be interested in this. It does actually burn starch at the base of the flower, but it doesn't do it in a random fashion. It actually maintains a steady 24 degrees. So it needs to have some sort of thermostat. And so some scientists thought they would study this, see how it worked. And they found that the plant maintains its temperature using a unique mathematical algorithm. That's clever, isn't it? So, how smart do you need to be as a mathematician? Do you need to be as smart as a cabbage? No, you just need to be a fraction as smart as the creator of the cabbage. No one believes that a thermostat system that can maintain a steady 24 degrees, which I think is what the air conditioning in this building is set to measure, but no one believes that evolved by chance. No, it was designed by engineers and by computer people who worked out how to get it to sense what the temperature was and whether it needed to adjust the furnace up and down in the plant, or the cooling up and down if it's air conditioning. Believing that this plant developed its own thermostat is about as smart as being a cabbage. So let's move on to this other biological process, right? Adaptation. Adaptation is actually a design feature. It needs to be built in before it's needed. Now, you've all experienced this. But you're not evolving, you are adapting. If you've gone out and decided that you will take up running or some new sport, and you come home the first day and you go, oh, I think I've discovered some new muscles. Well, you haven't actually discovered some new muscles, you may have discovered them, but they were there. They just weren't working. Right? They didn't develop because you decided that you would go out and give them a workout. If you decide, well, I will keep going, and eventually you come home and say, I feel pretty good, right? You've adapted. You've changed, but you haven't evolved. All you have done is your body has responded to the increase in activity, it's turned on the appropriate genes, and so you've made more muscle proteins, and you've made your heart stronger, you've increased your all of those things, right? You've changed. Change is real. So let's have a look at an example of that out in the real world. Let's look at some tall trees. And this is another example of where we have evidence of that original good world with the mist rising up. Now, we have some very tall trees in Australia. In fact, I think the Tasmanian mountain ash is probably the world record holder, but I don't know whether that's been formally established. The Americans insist the world record holder is the sequoia tree, and it's a very interesting tree. There is a problem. If you get your water from roots down in the ground and you are several hundred feet high, the water has to move a very long way and defy gravity in order to get up to the top. Now, the plant does have a plumbing system which will allow that to happen, and water vapour is exuded from the top, and that does help the system flow, but there is a limit to how long that will work. And that is why sequoia trees will only grow in limited environments where there is lots of fog. Remember the rising mist. So yes, sequoia trees do very well in the original good world. But after the fog has cleared, they still have to survive for the rest of the day. And so again, people decided to study how do the leaves at the top of the plant survive until another fog rolls in. So they looked at the microscopic details of the leaves at the top of the tree, and they wrote this: in coast redwoods, water storage in foliage near the site of photosynthesis, in other words, where they get lots of sun, may be an important physiological adaptation that maintains the water status to help overcome the constraints of the water supply. In other words, it's hard for the plant to keep the water supplied up there, so it needs an adaptation. Now, this is actually a real adaptation. The leaves do change with increasing height. They have a special type of water storing tissue, and as you go further up the tree, and they took samples from leaves as you went up the tree, more and more water storing tissue until you got to the top of the tree. This is a true adaptation. But the trees are not evolving. This is occurring within the one tree. It is a genuine change. What about another example that is called adaptation? Here are some of the world's greatest but unsung heroes, right? Dung beetles. Right. Now, we should be very grateful for dung beetles. Definitely. Yes, they have this essential function of going out and collecting the dung and rolling it up, taking it away and burying it, which fertilises the ground as well as cleaning up the environment. Very necessary. Now imagine what the world would have been like in the time of the dinosaurs if there weren't dung beetles. But we know they were there because we have the evidence of their work in the fossil record, in the fossils. Right. Now, what they do is when they've found their delicious piece of they don't eat it actually. Well, they do actually. They take it away and and it does fertilise the ground. They roll it up, and then they have to work out, well, where am I going to take this before somebody else comes along and nicks it off me? And so they climb up on the top and they have a look round and they get orientated. Okay, so they turn on their GPS and work out which direction to go. So they have to look for some clues. So they take their clues from the position of the sun and the moon, very useful during the day. On very dark nights where there's no sun or no moon, they can even get orientated from the Milky Way galaxy up in the sky. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, beetles do astronomy. Who built that in? Right. But the other thing that is really useful is that they can perceive polarised light. And that's a pattern of light we don't see, which is just as well because we'd be just totally dazzled by it. But they can perceive pattern of polarised light and they can work out where the sun and the moon are, get themselves orientated. Now, some scientists looked at these and they found there were two kinds of beetles. There were nocturnal beetles and diurnal beetles. In other words, nighttime and daytime beetles. The nighttime beetles could work at night in any light conditions. The daytime ones could only work during the day. And so they thought, well, there must be something in their brain cells that they're not responding to the various signals. And this is a little summary from National Geographic News, which I thought put it very well. Nighttime dung rollers adapted to the poorer light by switching from navigating by celestial body, in other words, sun, moon, or Milky Way galaxy, to navigating by polarised light spread out across the sky, maximising the visual information available to the beetle brains. In other words, they could use all of those different cues and their brains switch from one to the other depending on the light conditions. Nocturnal beetles could use the sun by day. They could switch to the pattern of polarised light by night. In other words, they could work shifts sort of 24/7 if they needed to. And collecting dung is a 24/7 need, isn't it? Right. The diurnal beetles couldn't make that switch, so they could only work during the day. So, did the nocturnal beetles develop an extra sense all by themselves? Was that the adaptation? No, they already had the ability to adapt. Maybe the diurnal beetles lost that feature and could now only work during the day. Interesting. We don't know because we can't go back into history, but it all fits the biblical pattern rather than the evolutionary pattern from what we observe. So the original state probably was that the beetles could work day and night and some of them lost that ability. It fits the biblical picture. It was good. There was creative design. There was adaptation. Sin and judgment came into the world degenerated, so we have the struggle for existence, the struggle to survive. We have natural selection. We have loss of function. We observe all of these things. They're real. Now, don't think that time is going to be able to overcome this either. The evolutionists like to hide behind millions of years. If you are on a downhill run, if you have more time, where will you end up? Further down the hill. Exactly right. So, when we look at the living world, we see brilliant creation. Things were created for the good world. We see a cursed world and we see things surviving because they already have really cleverly created features. Adaptation, the inbuilt ability to cope with changes in the environment or activity, it's a design feature. Natural selection allows some living things to survive, eliminates those that don't already have those survival features. It is the result of degeneration of the environment. Now, this is rather a depressing sort of worldview, isn't it? And we've called our conference Good News. Well, of course, there is good news, isn't it? The world has changed, but it hasn't evolved. But it was created by a God who loved this world so much. The world has changed, but God hasn't, and that is genuine good news.